Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Serge Bui. For those who haven't met me before, for one of the three first conferences, video conferences that we've held, this is session number 4, and we'll focus on the government investment and taxation, and we'll provide as well an international overview of some of the things that happen in other countries and how Canada ranks on some of those issues. So we're really pleased to have this fourth session. We've had 3 great sessions to date. I would like to remind everyone to ask questions. You use the Q&A buttons that are at the bottom of your screen. That's how we function. You can vote on the questions to make sure that they get a bit more prominence when we get to them, and we will look at them throughout the process. Thank you very much, and I'll now pass it on to our chair, Dr. Julianne Curran.
Thanks, Serge. Hi, everyone. I just want to thank you for participating in the 4th of our series of video conferences today that's organized by the Agri-Food Innovation Council. Just to give you a little bit of background on AIC, for the last 100 years, AIC has provided leadership in its efforts to advocate on behalf of agri-food research and innovation. We are focused on development of policies and advocacy at the national level. Today, AIC is led by a board of directors that represent various parts of the sector. I am the VP of Market Innovation at Pulse Canada, and I'm also the chair of AIC's board of directors. Our other colleagues on the board represent different parts of the sector and hail from most regions across Canada. Our membership includes national, provincial, and regional organizations, as well as companies, industry associations, academic institutions, and government organizations, all interested in policies related to agri-food research and innovation. They have joined AIC to help shape, support, and accompany our efforts to support a strong presence for Canada in the field. If you have not done so, I encourage you to join AIC to participate in the discussion and to help us develop sound policies and strengthen our voice. As more focus is placed on food production, food safety, and food security, there have been global efforts to increase investments in agri-food research and innovation. In Canada, this includes government, academia, and the private sector. The intent in this video series is to identify how policies could support the development of a stronger investment system in our sector's research and innovation system. AIC wishes to extend a thank you to all of our conference partners, including Ag Expert, Canadian Science Publishing, Protein Industries Canada, AgWest Bio, and Mitacs. So at this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Raj Laddha, Emeritus Professor in Plant, Stress, and Ecophysiology, and former Chair of the Department of Plant, Food, and Environmental Sciences in the Faculty of Agriculture at Dalhousie University, who will be acting as today's moderator. Over to you, Raj.
Thank you very much, Julianne. Welcome our panel, as well as our participants here. To just set the stage here, before I start introducing our panelists, just want to give you some perspective to it, actually. Agriculture is the foundation for human civilization, sustaining humanity on this planet, and to embrace economic and technological advancements. So sustain agriculture and to grow economic and technological advancements in other sectors, there must be concerted efforts to invest in research and innovation in agri-food sectors. Agriculture sector in Canada contributes to about $120 billion, which is about 7.3% of our GDP. Investments in R&D in agricultural sector in high-income countries resulted in 98% increase in agricultural productivity, with a 14% reduction in inputs. One of the indicators of R&D outcome is patents. Canada ranks 14th among the OECD countries in the number of patents filed last year. IP from agri-food sectors come from the processing industries mostly. Nearly 80% of our agri-food sector are small, medium enterprise, which is called SMEs. They always struggled for an R&D investment. 47% of SMEs requested for financing last year. They experience about 1.5 times more hurdles in getting financing. Canada's investment in R&D has declined to the lowest level since over the 2 decades, actually remaining at about 1.543% of GDP, while Israel and South Korea has it at about 4% level. Nearly 15 research studies reveal that public spending on national research systems has resulted in an average rate of return of 35%. Yet investment in agri-food R&D is considerably low on a global stand. So we are here to discuss all these dimensions and learn from our eminent panelists aligned today. I wish to take this opportunity to welcome our speakers and very much look forward to hearing from our panelists on this topic. Joining us today are Dr. Emily Gray. Emily is an agricultural policy analyst and the thematic lead for innovation and digital agriculture in OECD's Trade and Agriculture Directorate. She has worked on a range of issues, including projects on risk and resilience in agriculture, innovation systems in food and agriculture, and reviews of policies to improve agricultural productivity and sustainability in OECD countries and Southeast Asia. Carla Ventin is a senior vice president at Food and Consumer Products of Canada, has been leading FHCP's government relations for more than 12 years, representing over 150 companies that manufacture and distribute the vast majority of the food, beverage, and consumer goods found on our store shelves, restaurants, and in people's homes. She has experience in public affairs in the private, government, and non-profit sectors in Canada and abroad, with 15 years specifically in agri-food, including working for 2 federal cabinet ministers, the Minister of Agriculture, and abroad in Washington, DC and Hungary. Jesse Vincent-Herscovici is a vice president of business development at Mitacs. Jesse is responsible for strategy and leads a large national business development team. Through his involvement in a breadth of industries ranging from telecommunications and microeconomic components distribution to niche, it's called within quotations, high fashion labels, Jesse actively developed his relationship-centered approach to business development. Leanne Walker is an Assistant Deputy Minister, Research and Corporate Services Division, Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Under her leadership, the division administers the OMIFERAS and University of Guelph Agreement, supports research, knowledge transfer, translation, and oversees the provincially owned agri-food research infrastructure and delivers research programs. Leanne also serves as a director of the Research for Agricultural Research Institute of Ontario. The format is going to be our panelists will be making a short presentation for about 5 minutes or so, followed by a series of questions to our panelists. And at the end, it'll be followed by a question and answer session with a participant. Okay. Let me start with Dr. Emily Gray. Emily, the floor is yours.
Apologies. Thank you very much, Raj, and thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of the AIC conference. It is a very great pleasure to be here and have this opportunity to share some of our research. Just in case some people may not be as familiar with the OECD, we were established almost 60 years ago, and our aim is to promote policies that will improve the economic and social well-being of people around the world. We have around, I think it's 36 members at the moment, but we also work with a lot of key partners, including some very significant agricultural producers, such as Brazil, Argentina, India. But one of our key objectives is to offer evidence-based independent policy advice on a range of topics, including agriculture and more specifically, agricultural innovation. So I'd like to just touch on in my introductory comments, a few results from some of the key projects that we've worked on. This includes one of our flagship initiatives. This is our annual agricultural policy monitoring and evaluation work, where we look at policies for the sector, including those that are supportive of innovation, as well as some recent work that we've been doing on reviewing policies for innovation, productivity, and sustainability in the sector, and some more specific work looking at taxation policies. So these projects have allowed us to look at the trends in investment in research over time in a large number of countries. And one of the things that we can see in terms of where Canada fits in on this is that investment in research is high. Public investment in research is high in Canada. If we look at it in terms of how the sector sits in terms of public investment relative to agricultural value added, it's been fairly consistent over time at around 2%. But compared to a lot of countries, it has declined over the last 17, 20 years or so. We found a similar similar sort of trend happening in private investment in agricultural research. But while the level of investment in research has increased over time, relative to the value of the sector, there is a general trend of declining. And this can be a bit of a challenge because, of course, investment in research is such a significant and important way of actually driving productivity growth, competitiveness, and sustainability in the agricultural and food sector. We've also done a bit of work recently looking at taxation policies across the various countries. It's quite difficult to draw meaningful comparisons across countries, mainly because tax systems are so diverse across countries. Moreover, many of the tax incentives that are available for agriculture and food are also generally available for other parts of the economy as a whole. So pulling out key findings for the agriculture sector can sometimes be a bit difficult. But what we do know is that across countries, a wider range of different tax incentives are available to countries. This includes different taxes available at the farm level, for example, income tax, property tax, taxes on goods and services, various exemptions and credits, environmental taxes, for example, carbon taxes, and perhaps most relevant for this particular seminar, tax incentives for R&D and innovation. And these are quite significant in Canada. And indeed, there are some very successful programs relative to some other countries. And when I say successful, I mean that there is some evidence that they actually do stimulate innovation and yield a return. So this particular webinar is of extreme interest to me because I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of the comments from the other panelists, because one of the findings from this research is that there's very little evidence on the effectiveness of tax policies. Across countries, many countries have relied on these kind of instruments for a very long time as a way to incentivize innovation. But an important question is, to what extent do they actually lead to innovation? Not just improved investments in research. There's a fair bit of evidence that they can in fact lead companies to invest more in research. But an important question is, how do these policies actually stimulate innovation, new innovative outputs that actually contribute to increased productivity and sustainability? At the moment, we're in a time where most sectors across the economy are under a great deal of stress from COVID-19, not just from the impacts of the disease itself, but from the various measures that have been put in place to try and address and manage the spread of the disease. And innovation is probably going to be one of those things that can help countries to recover, to stimulate sectors and lead to more growth. So this question of how can we stimulate innovation and investment in the agricultural and food sector is highly relevant at the moment. And in particular, for governments, including Canada's government and the provinces, how can we stimulate investment and innovation that leads to productivity growth? What kind of investments, what kind of policies will actually lead to the innovation that we're hoping to achieve. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing sort of some of the discussions to come. But I think this is one of the key questions. There's a lot of experience with these kind of policies across countries, but which ones will be most effective? Which ones will deliver the most bang for the buck for governments and also for the sector? So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. And I will also take advantage of the Q&A box to share with you some of our reports, so that for those who might in the audience be interested in looking into a bit more, diving into these kind of reports, the link will be there for those who might like to have a look.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. I really, really appreciate that. I'll now ask Ms. Carla Ventin to present. Carla?
Thank you, Raj, and thank you, AIC, for organizing this conference today. I wanted to provide a bit of context over there in perhaps a silver lining. Over the past 8 months, we saw across Canada many businesses shutting down. While at the same time, we saw that agri-food businesses were actually ramping up production. And that they were focused primarily and had to pivot very quickly to provide essential food products on store shelves for Canadians. So during the last 8 months has been an extremely busy time for the agri-food sector. The silver lining on this is that I think that for the first time in a very long time, both the government and Canadians, this made both the government and Canadians truly recognize the essential nature of the agri-food sector. And we have captured the attention. As well as we see the government and Canadians also recognizing the dedication of those frontline workers, both on the farm, in food manufacturing facilities, in grocery stores right across the country. And the governments, both at the provincial and federal levels, have importantly recognized the agri-food sector as critical infrastructure, and at the provincial level as essential business. And so ensured that we are able to continue to operate during the pandemic and to continue to provide food to Canadians. I'm really pleased to be on today's panel. I think it's a very timely conversation. How do we promote investment into the sector, especially during the pandemic, recognizing the essential nature of what we do. A bit of background. I work for Food, Health and Consumer Products of Canada. We represent manufacturers and distributors of most of the products you see on grocery store shelves, but also drugstore shelves. So I'm obviously here to speak on more the food manufacturing value added side today. What's important to keep in mind here is when we talk about the contribution of our industry to the economy and in COVID recovery is that the food manufacturers are the top employer in manufacturing in Canada. And that is largely unknown by a lot of folks, but it's becoming more known because of the pandemic. So basically where things are left off at the farm gate, we pick it up, we add value, our members add value and work closely with farmers to deliver that food in Canada and around the world. And so the member companies that I represent range from small, independently operated to large global multinationals, representing the vast majority of products that you see on grocery store shelves. A little bit more background I wanted to provide to kind of frame up the discussion today is, so what we have been doing and our industry on the food manufacturing side over the last 8 months of the pandemic. So as I mentioned, there was a lot of shutdowns, there was a lot of disruptions. While at the same time, food manufacturers were increasing production, investing heavily to keep workers safe, retooling their manufacturing facilities so they can continue to make food, and trying to hire more workers as well. So it was a very different experience that was experienced by our sector than a large sector of Canadian industry. And this all came at a cost. And it did have a big impact on the sector. And I think this is kind of leads us up into why we're here today in the discussions. We've seen and we see today continuing disruptions and delays to the supply chain, which make it difficult making it difficult to produce food in Canada when we can't get the ingredients and packaging and raw materials into Canada because of supply chain disruptions and COVID due to COVID. We also lost customers. We're not providing to a lot of restaurants anymore across the country. So that's been a really difficult time. But what the impact is And what the impact has been is that many of our companies are saying they are now not going to be investing in Canada. They are going to be deferring those investments because their costs have gone to addressing the pandemic and the immediate costs that they had to do to continue to make food. So those capital investments and other investments are being deferred or postponed. So that kind of leads us, I guess, to the conversation today. So I look forward to providing more kind of context and thoughts in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Very much appreciated. Jesse, your thoughts.
Thank you, Raj, and hello, folks. It really is a pleasure to be here today, and my co-panelist Carla just mentioned some of the importance of well, that food and the awareness of where food is coming from has become more clear as this pandemic hit, but I think it was actually a growing trend even before COVID. And the idea of the food sustainability and even food sovereignty as a nation, as a country, has become more and more on the top of even pop culture and people's minds. So pleasure to be here for that reason. Although we are industry agnostic as an organization, Mitacs, certainly food, agri-food, agriculture is very, very important as animals, but especially as Canadians, given our economy. I will mention that although I'm responsible for the national team, my colleague Iman is here with us today, who is a sector prime account manager responsible for agri-food. So just to mention that he is there, and I may point towards him as needed, and certainly for follow-ups in this space, happy to be proactive there, and Iman can follow up with anyone as needed. I'll mention another quick caveat, which is we're a little bit of an imposter here, Mitacs and myself, because we're not really linked to taxation nor regulation, but we are linked to, I think, a fairly creative way for governments to stimulate, investments and try to catalyze companies and industry to invest in R&D and innovation and collaborative innovation with other organizations, with the post-secondary. So for that reason, I think it does fit. Hopefully you agree. And I also think that it's very important for us, as a country, but as an ecosystem, to connect all these different pieces. And gone are the days where there are individual elements that just act in silo within the economy, and then they all kind of fit together when they hit the market. I think we need to integrate and better understand how we fit together and put energy into harmonizing the various offers, the various solutions, the way that those fit together, up front, during, after, to make sure that it's a little bit more cohesive. And that's one area where Mitacs has been putting a huge amount of energy in the last few years to try to create partnerships. And those of you following us have seen us creating many of those partnerships. So our model is a little bit different. We invested in a traditional business development account management strategy to invest in boots on the ground. We did not invent this model. We did kind of bring it to this space, though, I believe. We invested heavily at the beginning in understanding the post-secondary world. We have a team of just over 80 individuals, business development. A third of them are embedded within the universities and colleges. All Canadian universities are members of Mitacs. We have very deep, intricate relationships with them. We know them very well. We know the researchers. We understand what makes them tick. What are their various motivators? We know the offices of research services, the machine, they know us, and then senior management as well. So a very, very heavy emphasis at the beginning of Mitacs was to know the post-secondary space. And then we were interacting with local industry and then pushing that more and more and growing it to the point that the team Iman is on, the account managers, are dedicated 100% to industrial major accounts. Those aren't just large accounts. Those are accounts where we have very, very intricate relationships with and design, co-build large long-term research and innovation projects with. But then we liaise back to our colleagues within the post-secondary. So it's a very classic innovation pull model where we've invested in going and listening to what companies' needs are. What are their pain points? What are they looking to do? What are their aspirations? What are competitors doing? And then identify within that spectrum of needs, which ones are conducive to partnership with post-secondary, but also B2B through partnerships with the post-secondary. So it's an open innovation model, innovation pull model, where we really try to understand the needs, identify those that are conducive to partnership, and then match them with other organizations, companies, researchers, institutions who have complementary needs, interests that could be solutioning some of those needs on the industrial side. I say that we're agnostic, but we actually have supported this industry considerably since 2012. Pulling some numbers, we've put together almost 5,000 internships specifically within this industry. That's almost 1,400 students and postdoctoral fellows, almost 1,000 researchers from 74 academic institutions, over 700 companies, $75 million in direct project funding in cash. So, we're industry agnostic, but we're certainly playing in this space. Thank you.
Wonderful, Ashley. Thank you so very much. It's a great, nice overview about, I think Mitacs have got a great role to play basically in terms of that ecosystem building actually, which is very critical for the innovation to sustain for a long period of time. Thank you so very much. I'll now ask Leanne Walker to present. Leanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raj. And good afternoon, and thank you to AIC for inviting me to speak at your event today about the role of the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, or OMAFRA, and the role that we play in research and innovation for our agri-food sector here in Ontario. So the ministry does not have control of the provincial tax policy. Obviously, that's the Ministry of Finance. So my focus will be on the programming that we provide through the ministry on research and accelerating innovation. So we recognize that agricultural innovation is a key driver of economic growth in the agri-food sector, enabling greater competitiveness as well as opportunities to meet food security and sustainability goals in Ontario and around the world. Agricultural innovations have contributed enormously to the transformation of Ontario's agricultural sector over the last 50 years. So that has strengthened both our competitive position domestically and internationally. We know that in today's world, investments in agri-food research are limited by fiscal realities. This was the case pre-COVID, but certainly even more relevant given the current pandemic. We also know that increases in land use are no longer feasible as urban encroachment happens. So technological competition is also growing from emerging agricultural export countries. So there's lots of barriers or issues facing our sectors and research and innovation today. So we know that unless we capitalize on our strong innovation potential, Ontario's agricultural productivity gains will be unable to sustain momentum in today's changing global trade environment. So OMAFRA's suite of programming supports a broad range of research and commercialization programs for the industry. So one of our key program supports is the Alliance, which is a tripartite agreement between ourselves, the University of Guelph, and the Agricultural Research Institute of Ontario. And that under that agreement, we invest in state-of-the-art research expertise and research infrastructure capacity to undertake world-class research that benefits all of Ontario's diverse regions. That agreement provides $66.1 million annually to the University of Guelph in support of both the research infrastructure and research programming. We currently have 17 research stations, and they serve as a platform for research and commercialization programs to validate market feasibility and create prototypes to support scale up to new tech. Many of you may be aware of the Griffin's Lair program, which is leading to accelerated adoption of innovative research. It's been a very successful program and part of that agreement with the U of G for many years now. We also offer research programming support through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is funded jointly by the province and the federal government. As OMAFRA supports both research and research station infrastructure, we are in a unique position to help advance agri-food research and innovation. So while I can't speak directly to the issues of taxation, I'm certainly happy to discuss OMAFRA's role in the agri-food innovation space. Thank you, Raj.
Thank you, Leanne. Really appreciate it, actually, giving a different perspective on university industry partnerships as well. That's a great place to be in now, actually. Thank you all for the insightful presentations. It's really marvelous. We have a wonderful panelists. I'm sure that our participants will be extremely happy. It's now time to turn our attention to a series of questions to our speakers. In preparation for the Q&A session that will follow, participants are invited to provide comments or questions using the Q&A tab, which Serge was mentioning a few minutes ago, at the bottom of your screen, actually. So once we receive those things, we'll formalize it in terms of the ones which receive the highest voting. Basically, we'll try to address those questions. Having listened to our panelists, actually, and having known the importance of agriculture and investment in research, development, and innovation, let's have an understanding, actually, in terms of how does Canada and its provinces compare to other jurisdictions in terms of funding and taxations. Now, I know that everybody is not aware of taxation, but those who could present some ideas in that particular order, that'll be great. But it's nice to have a viewpoint in terms of positioning as a country to really understand where we are. So I would call upon Emily to start it. Emily, can you address that one first, please?
Certainly. Can I just check that you can hear me? There's some building work has just started upstairs. Okay, excellent.
Yep.
So I think this is the hazard of living in Paris. So I mean, one of the first places that we can look for sort of to understand the trends in how Canada compares to other countries is actual levels of investment in R&D and in innovation more broadly. One of the most useful ways of actually kind of comparing different expenditures is trends in research intensity, so investment relative to the size of the sector. And essentially, Canada's around about in the middle. So we see that in terms of public investment, it's around 2%. So 2% relative to the value of agricultural value added in the sector. And when we look at more the private sector, it's a little bit lower, so more around sort of 0.5 to 1%. In terms of how that then compares to other countries, in terms of public investment, fairly around the middle of our OECD member economies. There are some other countries that have significantly higher levels of investment. So for example, some European countries, Ireland, Denmark, Germany, they have levels of public R&D intensity of around 3.5, 4%. So in this respect, still around the middle, but there are countries that are doing more. Whether or not it's a good thing that where Canada is a different question entirely, because of course, the further question is what is the payoff to that investment? And indeed, there may be a higher payoff to some of Canada's investments. When we look at sort of more the tax expenditures, there are, of course, some pretty significant differences. All countries use different measures, but as I mentioned earlier, Canada does rely quite heavily on tax incentives. Another key difference is that there are differences within the provinces. So this is something that appears mainly in the countries that have a federal structure, the United States, Australia, Canada. So that there are differences in the types of incentives across the country as well. And this indeed might affect how countries, how private companies do in fact invest for that reason. The only sort of other thing is a key point is how these trends might be changing over time. And we have seen that public research intensity in Canada has declined over time. And Raj made effectively this point in his introduction. Similarly, private research intensity has also declined over time. But to some extent, this also reflects the fact that the value of the sector has increased. The level of expenditure has increased, but the value of the private, apologies, the more noise upstairs. the share of investment relative to the size of the agricultural food sector, the private sector, has declined. So that's where we see Canada sitting relative to other countries.
Thanks, Emily. We'll come back to some of the questions we need to answer that in terms of how to be able to modify and things like that later on. Jesse, you have any idea in terms of, I know that you are dealing with most of the post-secondary institutions and industry partnerships. Where do you see that one in terms of investment, basically? How do we compare to other countries or other provinces?
Thank you, Raj. And I was going to maybe get into the post-secondary piece a little bit later, but and again, the caveat that we're not experts, and I'm not an expert in taxation, so I will politely sidestep that one. Sure. But in terms of funding, and I was going to reiterate what a lot of the points that Dr. Gray made, that Emily made, at the risk of quoting OECD stats in front of OECD, always a delicate position to be. But I'll put a little bit more, because my answer to your question is that although Canada is doing a lot of very interesting, innovative moves to be, to better support industrial R&D and innovation, I think we are definitely not doing enough. And I think, Emily put it diplomatically, I think we're definitely slipping in most of the metrics we don't want to be. If you look at the OECD average for gross domestic spending on R&D, percentage of GDP has been growing for the average OECD countries the past 15 years consistently, going up to that 2.5% mentioned in 2018. Ours has been decreasing, from about 2% in 2001, down to about 1.5 or less in 2018. This is the wrong direction, strongly the wrong direction. Certainly if you compare it to some of the front of the pack like Israel and Korea, we're dropping off of that curve strongly. I appreciate to say that we're middle of the pack. I'd argue that Germany, Japan, US, other European countries are around average, and we're not quite there right now. Canadian food processing, specifically expenditures on R&D, has also been steady decline, down to under 25%, 2017, down by almost 25%, compared to 2008. So I think it's pretty clear that we have a bit of a problem, and we need to try to catch up quickly. One last stat in terms of Canada versus global competitors in R&D investment, spending less than 0.2% of sales in R&D compared to 0.6% by the United States and by Netherlands. So just to answer your question squarely, I think the answer is no, we're not quite doing enough. We're doing a lot of very interesting things. We have a lot of very strong assets, but I think we need to better leverage them, and we need to put money where it is most important. And those trends are mostly domestically going down.
Right. Thanks, Jesse. Leanne, your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Raj. So I certainly agree with Jesse's comments, but we are a bit unique in Ontario because of the agri-food research capacity for infrastructure that we fund. When we look at other provinces and other international jurisdictions, that's a pretty unique agreement that we have with the University of Guelph and with the Ag Research Institution of Ontario. So, those 15 research station properties are accessible by our researchers, whether they're researchers within the University of Guelph or whether they're research outside of the university. And we've developed capacity over the years in field crops, livestock, greenhouse, horticulture, turfgrass, and aquaculture. So there is quite a diversity in terms of our research station. Other provinces, specialize in specific areas, and that has a lot to do with the type of crops that they grow relative to Ontario. We've been able to really amass resources across several primary sectors to allow Ontario-based solutions to support our diverse agri-food sector needs, right? So, yep. So I think, we look at University of Guelph in terms of the university itself is ranked very high in terms of its research capability. So when you couple that with the investment the provincial government has made through the 10-year agreements that we have with the University of Guelph, that arrangement really is one that many jurisdictions look to as best in class. So.
Leanne, do you really see that there is a disparity in terms of investments in R&D or innovation between provinces or among the provinces? Actually, I know Ontario invests significantly, about $61.5 million just in a partnership with Guelph. And do you see a similar arrangements, or how is the investment reflecting with other provinces? Any ideas?
So I don't really know exact numbers for other provinces.
Okay.
As I said, when we did review our agreement with the University of Guelph, and at that time we did do a jurisdictional scan. And one of the things that came out of that jurisdictional scan was that the partnership with the university is seen to be a best practice or a best in class model, and something that other provinces don't have, and we're able to leverage that. So I can't answer that specific question, Raj, but I do know that there is lots of value to that agreement.
Sure. Thanks, Leanne. I appreciate that. Carla, I'm looking at this in a different perspective as well. I know that we talked about the variation in R&D and innovation investments across different parts of the world. Looking at those, how do you think actually, how can government support our programs be shaped to help encourage your investment in the agri-food sector? Carla, any thoughts on it?
Yeah, sure. So I think that it was great hearing the other panelists. I think that we could definitely be doing more. First of all, we need more investment in the sector. So I can provide a bit of a perspective from the food manufacturing lens. So we worked, for example, with the Canadian manufacturers and exporters, and they launched a survey with manufacturing executives of all areas across Canada, including food manufacturers. And the one thing that they came back with is that they were very discouraged by the government incentives and programs for innovation. And so that was one of their key takeaways, and the results of the survey are going to be launched tomorrow. So I won't go into more detail on that. When I look at innovation, I see kind of the way that we view it in our world is very in two ways. Process innovation, so looking at production line efficiencies. And that is very much important with all the labor shortages and chronic labor shortages in our sector. So that type of process innovation, and then product innovation, the new and exciting products. And it's not, and the importance here is what we hear from our member companies. It's also commercializing that innovation. They want to get it to market and they want to sell it. They want to be able to manufacture it as well. So if I look at, in conversations that we have with our food manufacturers, we know that, and this was one of the results of the survey that we partnered with CME on, is the high cost of some of these adoptions to process innovation is high. It's high cost. That's the biggest barrier. That's not that surprising. But one of the things that the governments and all levels of government can do to encourage more innovation and investment in the food manufacturing sector, so the value-added side, would really be acknowledging that it is a different manufacturing sector. Well, we're not the farmers, number one. And number two, we are different than other manufacturing sectors. We're not the same as auto, and we're not the same as aerospace, so we need to change the metrics. And so by that I mean, for example, we are not at Industry 4.0. The government, the federal government very much likes to see us and our members, and funding is tied on these grand innovations. It's just not realistic. Some of our member companies need the most simple things like investment in automation to become more productive. And what does that mean? It also means that promoting less labor-intensive ways to do things. So I think that that's really important. So moving the metrics away from that job creation and grand innovation, which is not realistic for the sector, toward more the modernization, increasing productivity. And I would just say a couple other comments about attracting investment in the value-added sector and agri-food sector as a whole. I did work for the former Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. And I can tell you, and it still is true today, but it has somewhat changed for the better. The vast majority, and I'm speaking from government and not all of the research bodies out there and academic institutions, but from the Government of Canada, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has traditionally and primarily been focused on primary production. So programs and support and research for primary. Once it leaves the farm gate, that's always, it seems to be an afterthought. And that cultural change and that needs to change. My final point is that when we're thinking about attracting innovation investment into this sector, we can't forget about those companies that are currently here. So we need to take care of the companies that are here and already doing the investment, and how can we encourage them? And then in addition, attracting more investment in innovation. And that's kind of like the aftercare piece, which I think is really important for the perspective we get from our members. Thanks.
Thanks, Carla. I think we got all those very important points about looking at the platforms around the world and within the country. Can you be very specific for the interest of our participants? Should Canada and its provinces do more in agri-food sector and research and innovation? If so, what do you specifically think where we should invest in that area? I know Carla touched on some of these things actually. I would start with Jesse this time. Jesse?
Sure, thank you, Raj. I think a few things, and I do want to come back because I wouldn't want to have painted too doomy of a picture of Canada before. I do want to come back on some of the strengths we need to acknowledge and then leverage better. There are enormous strengths around talent, around the research skills. It was mentioned at the entry of this panel, the patent rate, but also the publication rate within Canada per capita. We are absolutely punching well above our weight, and there's a lot of opportunity there. The challenge is how do we turn that into innovation truly? And there was also a mention, I think it was Dr. Gray, who talked about having measures that encourage the innovation versus more investments in the research per se. So being careful on what we're incentivizing, because that can get encouraged and grown, and that may not be the bigger picture we're trying to do, which is industrial commercializing innovation for society's benefit as a whole. One other area I think that we can do better at, and it was just touched on by Carla, is ability to grow our companies. For a number of reasons, I think it's difficult for Canadian companies to reach critical size and to build momentum. I think size of the market, access to the market, very large country, not that big a population, access to capital and access to talent. So market, capital, talent are the three major pieces. We have elements of that, but the question is, how do we bring them together, and how easily accessible are they? And at what stage are our companies exiting? I don't think it's a bad thing for Canadian companies to have international exits, but when are they doing that? And where is the valuation and maturation of the company when they do that? And then doing that, it can be very good. You have a number of entrepreneurs who can then reinvest locally. I mean, that's established as a good thing. Another area I think that is a strength of Canada, but also an area we need to build is intellectual property. And you mentioned that at the offset as well. And again, this is not my expertise, but I mean, Canada does have a fairly robust intellectual property framework and mechanism of protecting intellectual property. One of the areas that's been identified, and there's a number of champions throughout the country and pockets pushing for more of this, is how do we build up the intellectual property literacy of our entrepreneurs and of our researchers earlier on? So to understand how that play works, we've been quite good at the technology, but how do we build up IP assets, and how do we develop that into company assets? And again, that goes into maybe upping our game when we do reach the level of an exit. So these are all areas where I think we can definitely build on. Another area I want to stress, and this is probably highly subjective and can be very controversial, but I think we're a country where overall there's a fairly strong culture of collaboration, of openness, and there's a lot of diversity in this country, and that is, we're growing more and more aware of how that becomes a competitive advantage. And the less you have, niches or areas where you kind of have, shortcomings, and the more well-rounded you are, well, the better off you might be able to be. So, but again, the question is, how well do you leverage those different pieces of the economy and where they are? The last thing I'll say there is I guess it's, especially with regards to agriculture, especially, very good example, multifaceted needs call for multifaceted approaches. And I go back to my earlier comment about Gone are the days of individual one-off initiative or siloed initiatives that could then do their bit and another piece will jump in. They need to weave together very, very likely and very cohesively and purposefully. You can't leave the entrepreneur and the companies try to figure out these juggernauts of different offers and solutions and spend their time on websites trying to see what could they benefit from. They need to, and there needs to be an investment on their side, but there also needs to be a bit of heavy lifting to put them together better and to show what that process could look like. Going back to the multifaceted piece, different governments at different levels, at the provincial, at the federal, at the municipal level, all have areas where they can have influence, acting as policymakers, legislators, funders, facilitators. How do they all fit together? And likewise on the post-secondary or more academic side, the scientists, the researchers, and working with entrepreneurs, how are those ideas contributing to some of the problems that the entrepreneurs or the companies are currently working on, but around starting from the problem, not necessarily trying to push the solution or trying to push IP that was created in void of the problem. We need to start getting better at identifying the needs and then linking them to the right piece of the innovation ecosystem to then try to solution those needs. And the final comment about the multifaceted piece is also in terms of sectors. I think, again, gone are the days of just thinking of one sector in isolation of other sectors. Those walls are all coming down. And the ones who are able to play on the fringes of those different old frameworks, walls, are the ones who are succeeding the most. The ones who are able to see AI solutions that could be used in health, but also in agriculture, but also environment and transportation. I mean, these are areas that previously maybe weren't that obviously connected, but now almost the same solutions or the same technologies can go and inform them. But to do that, they need to be connected. To do that, there needs to be porosity, and there needs to be, I would humbly state, agents who are going around looking for, hearing the needs and looking to connect the different players within that ecosystem. Sorry, Roger.
Thank you, Jesse. No, that's great, actually. I think I want to just mention here, actually, for our members and participants here, Canada had 36,000 applications for IP as of last year, and only 12% of that are from Canadian applicants. Rest are all from elsewhere, actually. That's a trend. I think one of the successes of any business that has to be successful should be thinking about patents, so then have a finance that investors can come in there to be successful there. So the innovation, if it's to be successful, actually, we need to be thinking about patents, and that's going to be improving your success rate as well. Just to give you a spot, Emily, you have any thoughts on this one? Actually, about what should Canada do more? Any quick ideas on that, Emily?
I do, and I'd like also to just sort of build maybe on some of the points that Carla and Jesse made. I think they made some very interesting points about what the needs of the sector was. Before you get to the point of what Canada should do more of, Canada and its provinces should do more of, it's important to have a clear idea of what outcomes that are desired from this innovation. If it's a case of trying to target smaller and medium-sized enterprises in the agri-food sector, certain instruments might work better for them than others. So, for example, tax incentives often tend to be taken up more by the larger firms rather than the small firms. So relying heavily on that kind of an instrument may not serve as well if your aim is to try and improve innovation and adoption of innovations in smaller businesses. Similarly, there's also a question of, if the idea is actually that a lot more of these gains can come from promoting networks and greater collaboration, then perhaps a big thing that governments can do is actually to provide a network, to provide a way of facilitating those networks in order to get different sectors working together. It might be that grants are a more effective way of bringing both public and private actors together to work on innovation. Another question is, what kind of innovations? Is it more about those kind of innovations that are already available, they're ready to adopt, and stimulating that kind of adoption? Or is it more about some of that kind of deeper, more basic fundamental research that's forward-looking, maybe more in the sort of agriculture 4.0 space versus, things that can just help to maintain competitiveness? Until those questions are addressed, it's very difficult to say what you should do, because
Right.
different instruments will be more effective.
Absolutely.
And then again, probably the biggest challenges here is there's so little evidence on what is most effective. If you look at the literature, for example, and the grey literature, the evaluations of different policies and programs, there's almost nothing there. Tax incentives have been around for such a long time, but we really don't know how effective they are. And we really don't know how effective they are for the agricultural sector. So for example, and I'm trying to recall the name of the program, but I think it's the largest tax incentive program in Canada, the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Incentive Program. There's evidence that this actually does yield, a payoff. So rather than simply being a drain on public finances, it does actually yield a higher payoff from that program. But it's not really, we don't know if it's effective for agriculture and food. So beginning to answer these questions is a very much an important first step. And this is not just for Canada.
That's true. That's true. I think you touched on a very important point on taxation. I think probably in a competitive world wherein there's great lot of opportunities everywhere, taxation plays a very critical role. So the quick question to our panelists here is the taxation system in Canada hindering the ag food sector's research and innovation? Yes or no? Emily, why don't you start it? Actually, you were talking about the taxation for a bit.
The simple answer would be, I don't know. And I think this is one of those things where, again, what is the evidence? Is this something that the sector has identified as a problem?
Right.
But for example, I think we did do a review of Canada's agricultural innovation system, I think 5 years ago now. And one of the findings from that review was that lower tax rates for small firms might actually act as a disincentive to innovation and growth, and that having a similar rate of taxation across all firms might actually be something that stimulates investment. So a little bit contrary perhaps to what you might think, but these are again the kind of questions of how necessary it is to understand how different instruments affect the sector.
Right. Any of the panelists can jump in who wants to address this question. Yes, Jesse?
I would jump in. I wouldn't squarely answer your question.
Just a simple thing, yes or no. Is that no? And then we can go to the next one quickly.
I think it has merits, but what I wanted to add, and just wanted to piggyback on what Emily just said, I think we have to be careful how we define, the different measures we have. I think you make a good point. There's actually a tipping point in between in terms of the current SR&ED mechanisms in Canada. Again, not my expertise, but if you're too small in pre-revenue, then you can give me all the tax breaks you want on my revenue. If I don't have any, it's really of no use. And if I'm on the brink of going from small to medium size, or heaven forbid, medium to large, we don't really do that here well, but we would love to see more of that. But if you do that, you actually start losing off some of your tax advantages if you get too big. So I think there would be a good reason to think about how do we incentivize making sure, and maybe that level tax rate would be a part of the answer, so that if you're too small, you can shovel forward your tax breaks to when you are generating profit. And if you're getting bigger, great, that's a good thing. And we want to incentivize getting bigger and not staying on the edge of a certain size. And there's different examples like that. Last I heard, again, not my expertise, so my co-panelists can certainly correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but last I heard things like IP patenting and IP costs were not necessarily covered by shreds. And those are examples of definitely what should be a part of a good R&D and innovation portfolio, is how are you going to then protect that innovation? And we certainly need to incentivize protecting that directly. But speaking of directly, the other area I was going to go is so those are indirect measures to try to influence innovation. But what I believe is clear is that more direct measures are very needed as well. And to try to proactively go and understand what the organizations are trying to do and show them how they can put in place a roadmap, an agenda, a strategy that could reach that, but upfront, and vet that upfront, not after the fact. And why I didn't want to answer your question too squarely is I do come out of industry. We certainly used SR&ED tax credits. They were invaluable if you're trying to build something, an in-house R&D, a unit, but it's not enough as is, and it can also be, answered to the letter of the way that it's written and not necessarily lead to true innovation. So, but it very much can be a stable of it. So I don't know that it's quite such an easy answer, but all these pieces need to play together. And I certainly think we need more direct measures.
As you all mentioned, that there is no simple answer to it, and that taxation for our tax credits for R&D and innovation is very complex throughout the world. Every single country adopts different practices and different ways to support research innovation, and that becomes much more complex. Even within the country, BC, tax is 10%, and whereas Quebec provides a 35% tax refund. So it's just totally different. So, but that's going to create a sort of a concentration of ecosystems in one particular location. So it becomes very relevant in terms of how our investments are very well paid off, basically, in terms of our tax credit, which can be replowed into our capital, actually, for further innovation. Any other our members of panels and the panelists can give you a very quick answer, yes or no. Is our taxation system hindering development or investment in our R&D sector? Okay, seeing that, we'll move on to the next one, which is also very important thing. There's a declining participation of youth in the agricultural sector. That has been a constant problem in almost all developing countries or developed countries. In order for the country to be successful and sustain food security, there needs to be a succession and participation of youth in agricultural research and innovation, not only in just production, but also in research and innovation. Curiosity in research and innovation in science, technology, engineering, and math starts at a very young age. It's critical to create an environment in schools and colleges and universities working with the agricultural industries to create an innovation-rich environment. Should governments do more to invest in the next generation of agricultural or agri-food scientists or young scientists? I'll start with Leanne first here. Leanne, would you like to take this question?
Thanks, Raj. So I can tell you what we are doing under the University of Guelph agreement. There's a highly qualified personnel program. So that supports the development of highly skilled intellectual capacity to support the agri-food and rural sectors through scholarships to the Masters of Science for a maximum of 2 years, and for PhD graduate students for a maximum of 3 years. So each year we support 10 to 15 new participants in the program who also receive specialized in-class training in areas such as business, agriculture, and commercialization, as well as employment experiences, so work placements in agri-food and rural organizations, businesses, and governments. So since its inception, the HQP scholarship program has supported the development of 181 students. And those students obviously are the future researchers, the policymakers, and innovators in government, academia, the agri-food sector, and rural economic development. The other program we have is the Undergraduate Student Experiential Learning Program. And this is the program where students can develop skills, work on research projects relevant to the agri-food sector, and they are mentored by both U of G professors as well as staff within OMAFRA. So that's another program that we offer. And then finally, and I spoke a little bit about the Griffin's Lair commercialization program previously, it really does support the commercialization of research findings and aims to take the best research and use it to develop new products. We like to refer to it as kind of a dragon's den, where the researchers come and present their research and their ideas, and then grants and support are provided to those teams to understand and validate the market feasibility of the new products that have emerged from the research that they've conducted. It allows them to create prototypes, so things like performing field trials, removing any barriers to a market launch, and optimizing a minimum viable product that best meets the needs of the customers. And then they're able to also get guidance in terms of how to pitch their products to investors to support the scale up. So those three are all funded within the alliance agreement with the University of Guelph and ARIO. So that's what we're currently doing to support youth in the research and innovation space.
Thank you, Leanne. Any other panelists, Emily or Carla? Sure.
Yeah, I did want to comment. I think it's really important to support, youth in agri-food science for sure. But we also need to not lose sight of the fact that we need food on the table. So we need workers in facilities to make that food. So it's highly skilled workers are absolutely needed. But we also need the people to show up to those. I know for our member companies, they have 10,000 facilities across the country. We need those workers. So right now in in food manufacturing, there are 1 in 10 jobs that are vacant. And those aren't research jobs. And so we have a real challenge in this country. Now, what are we going to do to attract people to get in those jobs so we can have food on store shelves, or we import all our food? That is what the decision is. I do know from our member companies, they're telling us that the fact that they can't get workers to their facilities means that they're not investing in this country. Any investment, whether it's capital investment, R&D or anything, they're just not going to do it. But I do want to tell you, we've done a lot of surveying, a lot of conversations with Canadian food manufacturers. And what I can tell you over the last 8 months, I'll tell you what they have done and tried to encourage people to work in their facilities. So they're hiring, number one. Obviously, those we need to fill the 28,000 job vacancies. They've done employee engagement, appreciation initiatives, communicated how their investments are keeping workers safe, provided incentives. Over the past year, we've seen food manufacturers increase wages by 16%. But yet there's all these vacancies out there. So I think that there's a lot that the government can do. I think domestically, there's some pieces here. I think that we need to, and this is being spoken about, is making that connection between, well, what are the skills actually required, and the post-secondary institutions, and kind of making a match. I think also what we need to do is we need to be proud of the agri-food sector in this country. And we need to attract youth to the sector. And I think that there's a role for both industry, government, and academic institutions to do that. And I also think that, quite frankly, in order for us not to turn away any investment in this country, we need to be really realistic. The fact that we have 28,000 job vacancies, and we might not be able to get all of that from Canada. So we need to have programs like immigration and temporary foreign worker programs, et cetera. And the final thing I would just say on this front is that because we can't hire enough people, we need to automate. So support in that sector as well. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Carla. Thank you very much. Emily, Jesse, any thoughts on this, or we can move on to the next question?
Only to agree, I think, with a lot of what Carla had said. This need to try and make the sector attractive.
Right.
Part of this, of course, is wages. Wages
Right.
will always have a part to play in that. But especially when we sort of think about education, there have been some interesting initiatives in other countries, for example, linking agricultural related in education with green education, environmental education. A lot of the skills are transferable. So trying to build that broader skill set that reflects those interests can be quite effective. And of course, having industry involvement in actually the design of these kind of curricula.
Yeah.
It's not going to be effective if it actually doesn't meet the needs of what is needed in businesses.
Absolutely. Thanks, Emily. Jesse?
Yeah, Raj, a couple of quick comments, and I thought I'd share a bit of the data that we've seen on the Mitacs side. I will, of course, agree completely with Carla and with Emily that we need to get food from the crop, from the farm to the table. We need people to do that. Farmers feed people, and the idea of a rebranding campaign here, I think, is very interesting. One for industry probably to do, but I certainly cherish it warm-heartedly. It goes back into the interprovincial piece as well, though. It's not only a sectoral piece. My wife happens to be from PEI, from a farm family, dairy and potatoes, family of 6 kids, not one is still in PEI. and so we won't even go there, but we have some major challenges to uncover, and yet PEIs feed the country in French fries very well. Yep. So we need that. That's in terms of the automation, that's a bit of a different piece, and that comes back maybe closer to where Mitacs can help a bit more. I pulled some of the numbers, and this is really interesting. If you look at the level of the degree in going into projects that are agri-food, we had 2% undergraduate, 1% college. Part of that is because that's very new to Mitacs, so I think it's more historic than anything. But then, PhD 21%, master's 24%, postdocs 52%. I don't know another sector where I've seen the majority of the interns being postdoctoral fellows. That suggests some pretty sophisticated projects going on in agri-food. So that's very interesting. I mentioned AI, tons of interesting stuff going on in AI and automation. A lot there. One other quick comment I will make, and this refers back to the positioning of your question. You talked about, do we need to, invest more younger in science, technology, engineering, and math? And I would actually argue that, although obviously STEM is really cornerstone of a lot of what's going on in agri-tech, I think we need to, these are interdisciplinary problems. And I think we need to break, again, I go back to breaking old silos. These need to be interdisciplinary approaches to these problems. And we've seen the most sophisticated projects are where you have temporary R&D teams of interns coming together, but you're matching a psychologist who understands this consumer behavior or eye tracking devices of where do you position whatever, and whatever it is you're working on, working with computer scientists, working with social scientists. We're bringing in historians into gaming companies to understand the context, archaeology so these old walls are all breaking apart. And what is for sure is if you go in and study one thing, if you can only code, you're probably in trouble. If you only know history and you can't code or you don't understand that world at all, you're probably in trouble. So one of the things Mitacs stumbled on, it was from the beginning interdisciplinary, completely agnostic, but happened to be a big part of our success is we start from the need, and then regardless of where the solution comes from, we go and get it. And we find where the researchers are motivated to work on, where are they looking for data, where do they want to have more active partnerships, and then we build them around the need. And the discipline is just, it's just one of the boxes, but it isn't one of the prerequisites or a filter. I think that's the kind of approach that we need to use in terms of innovation.
Thanks, Jesse. I think we have only 2 more minutes actually to finish off our panel questions actually, before we go open it up for our participants. Final thoughts actually with respect to, that we talked about taxation, we talked about investments. There is yet another barrier, so-called barriers, I think. It's about regulatory affairs. It's becoming much more challenging, which is varied across the world, basically with respect to somebody wants to invest in Canada and build a business actually. These regulatory barriers are the key things in your thoughts actually. How do you overcome that? Very quickly. Why don't we just start with Jesse and we go with others quickly.
So this is not my expertise. I won't take up much time. I'll leave it to my colleagues.
Emily, you thought anything on your side that you want to communicate on that?
Just that there are always trade-offs. So while there may be some regulations in place that are seen to be restrictive, that it's important to recognize that they are actually there to achieve important health and environmental safety outcomes, particularly in the case of agriculture and food. But there are probably ways that they can be streamlined. So looking for those ways to improve clarity, consistency, responsiveness of these regulations to industry and consumer needs is probably one way to actually try and address them.
Okay. Any other thoughts from our panel? Yes, Carla?
Yeah, sure. So regulations, absolutely. Product safety, food safety is a #1 priority. But I think that the best thing that we can do in Canada is to have regulators have an economic lens. So they are not just, it's not just a responsibility to regulate, but they also have to think about the competitiveness and impact on the sector itself. Because if you're regulating so much and you're not thinking about that, then you're going to be left with nothing to regulate. and also better coordination between the regulatory departments. Health Canada seems to be working at cross purposes to what the economic departments in the country are working at, and even between Health Canada and Environment Canada. Health Canada says more labels and bigger labels, and Environment Canada says that's bad for the environment. And then just the final point on that, the streamline point, speaking about Emily's point, you know, we don't need to regulate everything either. There are alternatives to regulations. You don't need a new label when there's a problem. There might be education or other policies that you can put forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Carla. Wonderful. Final thoughts, actually, before we open up our segment to our participants. I could see some of about 5 questions listed here. We may not be able to answer all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many. Actually, we can do that. Open the Q&A tabs and begin posting questions. If we have any more, AIC will look at it. We'll send it to our panelists. We'll get their inputs, and that will be sent to all our participants as well. So the question is from Dr. Rana Mustafa. I think it's specifically for Carla. Carla, in your opinion, how to stimulate and increase investment in R&D in processing and value-added sectors compared to breeding?
So sorry, I didn't catch that last part. Stimulate investment into food processing?
Increase investment in R&D in processing and value-added sectors compared to breeding.
Oh, okay. Well, I can't speak on behalf of the breeding side, but you know, some of the comments that I touched on earlier. I think that we need to have incentive and investment programs that make sense for our industry. They're not the same that make sense for the farmers, and they're not the same that make sense for the auto and aerospace sector. And I did touch on some of those metrics that I think that need to be changed and a different lens applied. I would also say that we need to be cognizant of the fact that if you want to attract investment into this country, a lot of companies think if I'm attracting investment to this country in R&D, I want to commercialize that. I want to make it here in Canada, and I want to be able to sell it here in Canada. I think that that's a big part of the equation. And I also think that in order to make an attractive investment climate, I know on behalf of our companies, food manufacturers, they need to have a market to sell. And right now, it's very difficult and becoming much more expensive to sell in Canada's consolidated retail sector with new fees imposed on suppliers by Walmart and Loblaws, for example. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Carla. Emily, this question is for you specifically, and you mentioned a few countries investing 3.5 to 4% of their GDP intensity. Is a commensurate gain seen in agricultural GDP in the coming years? Has anyone taken this part to see where the best bang for our buck is?
That's an interesting question, and no, I don't know what the actual gain in GDP is. Particularly when those numbers are referring to public investment in R&D.
That's right.
And often that's the kind of research also that can have very, very long lags. Often when you model this, you might be putting lags of 50 years on, 20, 25, 30 years.
That's right.
So I think the question is, what will happen down the line? Those countries who are maybe investing less in that less public investment in research in that foundational areas that the private sector doesn't invest in, will there be a commensurate impact on the productivity of the sector when we look in 20 years' time? So I think that's possibly the best way I can answer that, not having the actual insights other than that.
Thanks, Emily. Appreciate that. There's another question from Samuel. I do agree with Dr. Gray. Patents shouldn't be the only indicator for innovation. In Canada, food processing plants are mostly small in size, and patenting will not be the solution. Will require different instruments. In fact, many food processors do not use patenting, but the other options, which is probably, I assume here, licensing or making in-house. Any thoughts to the panelists? Anyone would like to address this? Or it's just a comment, probably?
My only quick comment would be, I think even small companies need to build out.
Think about it.
An IP strategy from the beginning. I think, by the way, patents are one avenue for an IP strategy.
Right.
So secrecy could be another one. Defensive publication could be another one. Go and do research with an academic public institution, get it published quickly, be first to market. You could cut off some of the big players who would not get into it without a patent that they could protect. So
Right.
there are ways, but thinking about an IP strategy earlier absolutely fits for small as well.
Yeah.
I agree, the patent game is expensive, especially to protect, defend.
Right. This will be our last question to our panel, and anybody would like to take it, that'll be great. This is from Deborah Buzzard. Inspiring to see Government of Ontario government leadership in agri-food innovation and training partnership with Guelph. Could we imagine expanding this approach to harness the strength of agri-food research in universities for provinces across the country? Leanne, would you like to take this one first and let others follow?
Sure, thanks, Raj. As part of the renewed agreement with the University of Guelph, we've put in place measures for them to actually collaborate with other academic institutions, whether those institutions are within Canada or outside of Canada. We've also put, so there are key performance indicators around that collaboration. We've also put in key performance indicators around leveraging investment from industry, you know, in order for those collaborations, and I think Jesse spoke to that well, right? But the collaboration's needed.
Yep.
So what we're seeing is that there are, even in Ontario, a number of universities getting into the agri-food research space, or have been for a few years, and colleges. Niagara College would be one that would come to mind. And so what we're trying to do is really get the University of Guelph to start leveraging and partnering with them, and they have done that. And as I said, we've actually put in key performance indicators, because if you measure it, then there's the incentive to do it. So I think that's one way to get other universities kind of to the table. Our agreement is so unique. I don't know what other provinces might be able to do, but that is one thing that we're trying to do to make sure that we're getting the best researchers to the table, and not just limiting it to U of G.
Yeah, as we all discussed, actually, you know, any problem in agriculture and agri-food is so complex, it cannot be solved by one individual or one set of expertise. There are multi-dimensions to the issues. So collaboration is always the key, basically, whether it's going to be interprovincial or international or multinational. I think probably we have to think about the space research. I think there are problems that are very complex, and it has to be solved collaboratively. Thank you very much, Leanne. Any other thoughts, final thoughts before we close it? And I'm going to hand it over to Serge after this.
Maybe
Jesse?
Raj, just because we're talking about Guelph, I think there's something that Canada can do more of and better, which is un-Canadian in a way, but it's to acknowledge and identify areas where we have real successes and real wins. And what, you know, what Leanne described in Guelph is one of those examples.
Yes.
There's around 4 jobs for every 1 graduate who's coming out of that program.
8.
Ontario,
8 jobs.
8, so it's doubled since so I mean, you know, we need to identify what's been done well, and then promote it and multiply and leverage it, you know. And just a quick mention, one of the things we've done that relates to regulatory is our Canadian Science Policy Fellowship, where ministries, agencies and ministries like Ministry of Agriculture and Agri-Food have taken postdoctoral fellows to help advise and integrate into their teams and try to advise on policy. So these are things I think we can keep thinking of and keep innovating.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Jesse. Thank you very much, our panelists. Actually, I'm going to pass it on to Serge. Serge, take it over, please.
Thank you very much, Raj, and thank you very much to all of our panelists. This greatly appreciated and very interesting indeed in the discussion. And just so everybody understands and knows what we do at AIC is we normally look at some of the key statements that were made, and we'll do that through the 4 sessions that took place in the last month, and we'll provide some document at the end of the process that will probably try to inform policies that we're going to be pushing for at the federal level. So thank you very much to everyone for participating in this exercise, and for all of our attendees, if you have further thoughts on this issue or other issues related to investments in agri-food research and innovation, please do send it to us as well. And I do want to acknowledge what Carla said about the fact that it's not just about researchers, but if people don't work in in the processing plants, there's not going to be food on the table, and people will move away from making further investments in Canada if we don't have the labor force. I think this also has to be looked at, and even us in the research side need to really understand the key issues that are taking place there, and support all parts of the sector. So, thank you very much for your time. It's December 1st, 25 days or so before Christmas. We're going to wish you a great day, a great December, and hopefully a much better 2021 than 2020 has been for this interesting world. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Merry Christmas if I'm not seeing you all. Anyway,
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.